Henry Graves came back to the market in 2014, I was like, couldn't believe that I was going to have the opportunity to handle such an iconic watch from our past sale, the Time Museum sale in 1999, and it was still the record for the most complicated watch at auction, and then to have it arrive in our office and to have it in hand, it was a dream.
Fantastic watch.
Yeah, and then for it to go up in auction and achieve another world record, it was unbelievable. And then luckily enough, we've recently achieved another record with the English pocket watch with the George Daniels Space Traveller. They're both exceptional watches in their own right. George's handcraftsman watches are just unbelievable, the detail, and such a beautiful watch to look at, so balanced, there's so much symmetry in the movement and the dial.
It's crazy when you look at the movement of the Space Traveller, and it's so classically George in the way that it looks basically unfinished. There's no fancifulness, there's no ornate finishing, but it is so absolutely absurdly complicated. When you know, I remember when I looked at the front, I was almost in contrast more excited to see the movement than to see the front side. The front side was fantastic and beautiful, but the movement was just mind-bogglingly complicated. Really fantastic watch.
And it was all in his head as well. That was the amazing thing, is that he just understood it. He just knew where everything was going to go and how it was all going to be placed. And you know, the drawings are something that he wasn't particularly fond of.
I often wonder if that isolation on the Isle of Man for 2 or 3 decades basically allowed him to create that sort of genius, that moment of genius where he was so separated from everything going on elsewhere. He could just focus on being innovative and coming up with something new without caring whether other people were judging him, only to very briefly then come back to reality with the coaxial and pitching it to the world. But amazing
I think
watch.
he probably enjoyed making the Space Traveller for himself more, because that was purely for his own pleasure, and that he held on to that had it in his own collection.
My provenance probably would be Horatio Nelson's watch rather, that he wore on the Victory as he died. But it was just a movement. The case had completely disappeared, and it was set in a carriage clock case. But that was one of those things that you're really touching a piece of history, something that has changed and formed what we understand around us today. So that was definitely my moment of history and provenance.
Recently we had a gentleman come and see us who used to drive for Bernard White's Formula One team in the 60s, and Bernard White owned the racing team, and I think they came 4th in the Monaco Grand Prix, and I think it was 64 or 66. Anyway, they did the film about it, Monaco, he was one of the racing drivers in the team, and he got it as a gift from for Mr. White, and we sat down with him for about half an hour, and he just suddenly took out this incredible packet of black and white photos and photocopies of extracts from books and handwritten notes. And like signed, celebrity photos from the 60s. And he said, yeah, this is what I did. I was racing this, and I raced that, and I had this Ferrari, and then I did this Aston Martin, and then we traveled around the world, and it was just this moment where you thought, well, and he knew Johan Rindt, and he knew Mr. Andretti, and, you just thought, wow, there was this sort of capsule of time when people in a certain space doing certain things in a very different way to today were literally mixing with all the great names that have now gone down in history as, the sobriquets or the nicknames for specific watches. And it's sort of weird, certainly at my age, to suddenly have a connect between what has become almost a professional reference and the practical reality, someone who actually lived all these things and, was in the pits sweating and had, Jack Coy running around trading watches and, anyway, no other astonishing stories of provenance on the vintage side, but moments like that certainly pack their punch.
quite a while ago, I had to go to a really small Greek island. This guy had rung us and said he wants us to sell his collection and could we come and collect them from his villa. And arrived on the island, and he picked us up. Didn't want to go straight into talking business. He wanted to take us for a drink first, and it was one of these like party islands. And obviously I was very kind of business dressed.
Yes.
And he drove down the high street, which was typical sort of party island, nightclubs, cocktail bars, and took us for a drink in one of these cocktail bars. Everyone else was in like shorts, bikinis, and so I was there with my black bag with all my paperwork and a dark dress. Felt like I was there to sell insurance.
Yes.
And then he took us back to his villa, and I was expecting some really palatious, swimming pool, but it was like it was unfinished. It was behind a disused bingo hall, and on a sort of random road. He was quite an old gentleman, and he was like asking us, what do you think of the villa? Do you like it? And I was like, yeah. And it was just polished concrete everywhere.
Oh, wow.
And we took the collection away. Everything was weird, but everything went pretty smoothly. But then, because it was a tiny airport, the airport police stopped us, wanted us to unwrap everything, checking the paperwork. Their English wasn't good. Customs came in and said what was the purpose, and we explained, and they were fine.
Yeah.
But the police wouldn't let us go. They wanted to try and call the clients. They,
Check you weren't stealing it.
And I'm just keep checking my watch, thinking my flight's going to go. It's like serious. And they rang their headquarters. Everything they'd been trying the watches on.
Oh, no.
Like these provincial police, loving it. And then they said, "Okay, you can go." I literally had like 2 minutes to pack everything back in the bag, and I ran across the runway literally to jump on this little plane to transfer to Athens. And my heart, I thought I was going to be thrown into a little Greek jail for transporting stolen goods.
I confess again, much like the last time, because lots of people come to us, or because we're online, we don't actually have. I can't think of an incident of any description in the last 3 years, vintage-wise, where I've had to physically go and see the person and sort of sit down and negotiate. So we've had amazing phone calls and people come in, but never in person. The only thing I can think of was a close call where basically it didn't happen. After months of negotiation, and it wasn't really vintage, so I'm really going to break the rules a little bit here. But for 2 months I was negotiating the sale of the first Duality, and by Philippe Dufour, and the first Simplicity, or maybe it was number 2, I think the number 1, anyway, the gentleman owned both. And he was in a very nice sunny part of North America, and he'd got in touch, and we'd spent 3 months negotiating and agreeing, and it was appropriately complicated and backwards and forwards, and it took a huge amount of lifeblood out of me. I really felt exhausted at the end of this process, and at the end we said, okay, so we're going to do this, and I booked my flights, and the day before I flew out, unfortunately the gentleman changed his mind and sold them. He said, he literally used the now infamous words, I got an offer I couldn't refuse. And my heart just sunk, and I thought, oh no, this is terrible. And I went to bed for a week, I think, and didn't get up. But I had been looking forward to flying out to this very sunny part of North America and sitting down and spending a day negotiating finally, and signing and collecting and coming back and feeling top of the world, only for it not to happen, and then sort of wondering for a long time what happened.
Heartbreaking.
Heartbreaking beyond measure.
My experience is, I think, if we isolate it to just odd safes that I've been into, I think that would be. I mean, I've been to some safes in Swiss banks, and that are just literally just like things out of James Bond. Where you walk in, it's all mirrored walls, and you have to go into a particular part, and you're not allowed to walk out of there, and no photography. And but the strangest has to be a house, normal house. I mean, a very rich, well-to-do house that had an elevator in it, and the elevator went down into a sub-basement, and in the sub-basement was a safe that was the size of the footprint of the house. So it was a huge safe room, and it was full of the most unbelievable things. There was, with us at the time, there was a silver expert, and he said, "See that seal there? That comes from the 16th century, and if that came up for auction, it would be over £2 million." And it was, full of the most extraordinary things. And there was I,
Treasure
valuing a few very, very exciting watches that will never ever see the day of light, light of day even.
Yeah, I think the Daniel's market has definitely increased over recent years. His popularity has spread worldwide, whereas previously I think it was more localized to Europe. We've definitely got a lot of interest now from Asia and the Americas. But I do feel that pocket watches, I think if they're high quality, beautifully crafted, rare pieces with provenance as well, they will achieve the right price. We've had the English pocket watch sales where we sold the James Ramsey for about 900,000. But that's it's the combination of a beautifully crafted watch with provenance. I think that's what clients are looking for. They're looking for the rare and unusual, the really high quality items. Yeah, that hits the mark with today's market.
Yeah, I think you're right, totally. And I suppose the slightly sad thing is that you have these things like fantastic Frodsham tourbillons or Northern Goldsmiths, complicated watches that just haven't changed in price, and they are absolutely fantastic pieces and totally beautifully made. But I think you're right. I think when something has the mixture of the provenance and the technique behind it, then they do very well. They explode.
Yeah, I don't want to be the devil's advocate. I suppose I do agree with all the points made. I think George's legacy and the growth in worldwide interest in everything that he's done, and the sort of the impact of what he's had on so much of sort of watchmaking today, English watchmaking, etc., is such that I think we're only starting to see the sort of it's the cusp. We're not seeing, this isn't the maximum extent. This is just going to go bigger and bigger and bigger. I think as far as George is concerned, I think English pocket watches in general, unfortunately, I think with some exceptions, they're not necessarily exciting people yet. I think that a lot of these things go round and round, and this will come back. There can't be a world that I refuse to exist in a world today where beautiful examples of exceptional watchmaking that have incredible historical pedigree aren't recognized for what they are. But today, people aren't prepared to pay, at least in my eyes, what those watches are actually worth. They're only prepared to pay what they think might be a sort of a quick buck deal, or a relatively smart long-term investment price. So I think yes, provenance and history will always push up certain pocket watches, but I think unfortunately I think that's a very small minority, and I think we're a long way away from seeing the just blooming of the rest of the market. But when the Space Traveller 2 sold, I just thought, well, how fantastic is this? It's in such a short space of time, such a massive appreciation of value, and a number of clients call me up and ask, what do you think about this, and do you think, should we bid on it, and blah, blah, blah.
What did you say?
I said absolutely not. What a terrible waste of money. I quickly went and squirreled. I thought, right, I said, well, you can't really dispute it. It is what it is. It's a preeminent example, or the preeminent example of of modern day, quote unquote, English watchmaking. You know, it is absolutely the zenith of sort of what you would want to acquire if you were into collecting great English watches of the last 100 years.
And had such a huge influence on other watchmakers,
Hugely.
independent watchmakers,
Hugely.
even all over the world.
Massive.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just Roger, to his extreme, considerable credit, who's sort of carried the baton for George and has sort of so built on his legacy. Others have clearly been inspired in massive ways, and I do hope that will translate more and more in the future to people looking back at great English pocket watches.
Well, we're all waiting for the Frodsham, aren't we? With George's coaxial.
Yeah.
Not coaxial.
No, double wheel
double wheel,
escapement.
that's right. Yeah.
Whenever that will appear, we
Can't wait.
still waiting.
It's like that this Buzz Aldrin Speedmaster or whatever. It's just somewhere.
Yeah, it'll appear one day. Well, they do tell us, because they approach us to bid. It's getting less and less, because obviously Patek were quite prominent at buying, and they used to actually announce during the auction that this was bought for the Patek Philippe Museum.
I remember Breguet used to do the same.
Yeah.
They used to say, okay, when you say who's bought it, say the Breguet Museum.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
Big, loud, bold voice.
But it's definitely slowed down. They've probably acquired, enough pieces, or they're just waiting for really important pieces to add to the collection. I think when it does happen, they are prepared to bid those extra few increments, so it will push the price a little bit, but not massively, because they want to buy it for the right price, the right market price, so that it doesn't inflate the price necessarily.
I think it's so few and far between, isn't it? That it doesn't actually push the market particularly.
No.
Although, I mean, certainly when Breguet were buying their own pieces back, then there was that flurry of a few years where anything good you knew was gonna head in that direction. But I think you're right. I think that they've slowed down, and not they, but many of the museums have slowed down and just cherry pick the best pieces.
Yeah, which is fair enough.
Yeah,
They've probably got enough in their collections.
And they see things as well, and people write to them and say, we've got this, and so that I'm sure they have a lot of pieces that they can choose from.
Yeah. I mean, as far as I'm aware, at the moment, obviously there's been a lot of talk about Hoyer and sort of their efforts to sort of build up a collection that obviously now is partly contributed, I think, to the Globetrotter campaign that they've just launched, which has travelled the world. Some of it, I think, is obviously pieces that are coming up auction or on loan, temporary loan from big collectors. But I certainly as far as I was aware, or I didn't realise, again, simply due to experience, I suppose, that so many of these big watchmaking sort of greats actively announced that they were buying. I would have thought it was done quite discreetly, but I suppose with hindsight that makes sense. But you don't hear about it that much today.
No.
You really
not so much.
I don't know. Do Vacheron do that much?
No, Piaget do. Piaget are buyers.
Yeah, I think all the companies do to a certain extent. I mean,
Probably
certainly.
only Rolex are the obvious people that don't.
Yes.
They're not interested in
And
the past.
And I don't think it's had any effect whatsoever on their commercial success as a company.
No.
I did approach them once though about a watch and asking if they were interested in buying it, and they said that if they already had an example in their collection that was equal to or close to the quality of what they'd been offered, they had a standing rule not to replace it. So I think their museum does acquire pieces, but you have to approach them directly as opposed to
they wouldn't
necessarily
go
buying
to
publicly.
auction.
And that does actually make sense, because I know we've had people from Rolex, but they're not announcing the fact that they're from the collection. So
They're very secretive, aren't they?
Yeah.
The Rolex machine. So I'm not wearing a watch today. There's an empty space on my wrist because I'm desperately looking forward to receiving my new Omega Speedmaster 57 limited edition. And I think that, I look at a piece like that, and I think, what a spectacular re-edition of a watch that, the expectation is so legitimately high because it's such an important piece in their history, that any brand that decided they were going to recreate something like that would almost be setting themselves up to fail, because realistically it would be such a challenge to equal something that the whole collecting community can get around and say, oh yeah, this is a great re-edition. And they've done it, without question. The Railmaster, the Seamaster and the Speedmaster as individual limited editions have just been spectacular successes. So I think the vintage market is certainly inspiring a lot of things. I think that it will depend on each brand, how far they want to sort of go back into their core history and how well they think they're able to re-execute. But I'm aware of a number of projects going on with other companies where they're clearly massively inspiring themselves from pieces in their museums and from their history to bring out new watches. So I think that's only going to carry on more and more, up to a point.
I think collectors, there's always a desire for history as well. It sort of gives them individualism. It shows their knowledge and appreciation of brands. If they can sort of acquire a watch that's a re-edition, perhaps more affordable than the original, and then, but they can still, it's a talking point, they can wear it and talk about the brand's history. So I think, it's a very clever tool for the brands to use and sort of focus on clients' individualism, to, really sell their pieces.
Yeah, I always have a slight problem with exact copies or very similar copies, just because I always think that we should be moving forwards rather than just looking backwards. I think the reeditions have their place, but when they're overtaking the new pieces that are being designed and created, then I think that's a bit of a shame. I think what's round the corner, I wish we had that crystal ball. That's always been the problem. I think we'd all be very rich.
I guess the key is, I think the absolute sort of key is making it a limited edition. So you make it so that no matter, it's not just a new line piece. It has to be specific to a small number of pieces, so that it does acquire a certain kind of cachet before it comes out. And also, I think it's a good way to engage with young collectors. I really think that that's something that shouldn't be undervalued. It's tough sometimes to sort of tell people all about these incredible watches and to see them at Philips and to sort of share them on Instagram and say, okay, there's this £65,000 Speedmaster.
Philips, Bonhams and Sotheby.
And sorry, forgive me, Philips, Bonhams and Sotheby. Sorry, that's very true, I apologise. And a collected man. But I think it's a very good way to get people to allow them to sort of feel like they can at least connect in some way, because I think that's the hardest thing. It's not that hard after a while to seem rarefied and elite and to be offering the best pieces. But if then you're almost just baiting a certain part of the community by not having anything that they can reach. And I think as a way to engage with a younger demographic, as a way to make something seem a little bit more approachable and to encourage younger collectors who realistically are not going to be able to afford anything for a long time of any sort of real provenance, it's a smart way, as long as it's a limited edition, and as long as it's not done in a way to suggest that in any way it takes away from, but only enhances the prestigiousness of the original execution, then I think there's no harm in it. I think you're right, if it's produced in vast volumes and it's seen to be almost just a cheap rip-off that is there to just sell watches for the sake of it, then people are going to see through that, and if anything, that's going to detract from the value of the original. I mean, I'm not going to say who, but I think certain pieces recently have done that. But if it's done in limited amounts and it's well done, then personally I just think it's a great, and of course I'm extremely biased because I'm looking forward to getting one, so I can't, but I do take your point.
And that's limited to how many pieces?
I think it's 3,557, which is a big number, but for Omega is a tiny number.
It's a teeny tiny number when you multiply it by the world. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I should imagine there's a waiting list already.
Yeah, it's
Waiting patiently.
a bit of a waiting list, but I think it's all in the execution, the delivery, not necessarily in the concept itself. Yeah. And I think it's easily open to abuse. I just think it really depends on the way that the brand thinks about it and what they want to get from it, that determines whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing in really plain terms. But I know what you mean.
And I think there is also the aspect that it does help, as you say, the vintage market. Like anything, just building awareness that there are old watches that are attractive and interesting, and certainly with things like Omega and Rolex slightly playing on the 007 aspect of things. I think that it has its place, but it needs to be measured, as you say. It's not something that can be and also can't be the answer to their marketing problems. It's an addition. So yes, from that point of view, I agree with you. Yeah. Mm-hmm.